Meghan Markle is a lifelong feminist, which she's demonstrated by marrying a prince and giving up her job.
Jimmy Carr didn't just tell a joke that night, he detonated a reputation in front of millions. And the most terrifying part wasn't the laughter, it was the silence that followed. The kind of silence that feels like a verdict already decided, already sealed, already too late to escape. And right there, in that moment, something shifted. Because this wasn't just another celebrity roast, not another harmless late-night jab that disappears by morning. No, this felt different. This felt like someone had finally pulled back the curtain and said the one thing everyone had been thinking but nobody dared to say out loud. And suddenly, the room didn't feel like an audience anymore. It felt like a jury. You could almost sense it, people laughing but hesitating, glancing sideways, wondering, should we be laughing at this? Or are we watching something collapse in real time?
I said Meghan Markle is, of course, a lifelong feminist, which she's demonstrated by marrying a prince and giving up her job.
Because when a joke lands too clean, too sharp, too precise, it stops being humor. It becomes something colder, something final. That line didn't just sting, it exposed something. Because once you start replaying the narrative, once you line up the words with the actions, once you start asking uncomfortable questions, the story begins to look very different. And suddenly, the identity that was so carefully presented starts to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. 11 seconds. That's all it took. 11 seconds to compress years of branding, interviews, statements, and carefully curated public image into something brutally simple. And the scariest part? People didn't argue. They laughed because somewhere deep down it felt familiar. Too familiar. And then it escalated. A hostage? Prince turned into a punchline? That wasn't just comedy anymore, that was a narrative flipping in real time.
What I discovered was, of course, that she was hunting for a man, and she wanted wealth and she wanted fame. And there's no doubt she targeted Harry.
Because once the idea is planted, once the audience sees it, even for a second, it doesn't go away. It lingers, it grows, it starts connecting dots people weren't supposed to connect. And suddenly, every decision, every interview, every public appearance starts looking like part of a larger pattern. Not random, not misunderstood, but intentional. Then came the numbers. Cold, emotionless, impossible to argue with. Not 3, not even close. 383. That's not just a ranking, that's a signal. A quiet one, but devastating. Because numbers don't laugh, they don't exaggerate, they don't have opinions, they just sit there exposing reality without mercy. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because Hollywood can forgive scandals. It can forgive chaos. It can even forgive failure. But there's one thing it doesn't forgive: irrelevance. The moment the audience stops caring, stops watching, stops clicking, that's the real ending. That moment hit harder than any insult. Because it wasn't written by a comedian, it was written by reality itself. When your past success becomes the punchline.
King Charles visited the U.S. to mark the 250th anniversary of American independence from Britain and to seek the release of a British hostage being held by an American terrorist.
When the thing that once defined you is now used to measure your fall, that's when the story changes direction completely. And then Jimmy Carr stepped deeper into the chaos, not raising his voice, not adding drama, just delivering line after line like it meant nothing, which somehow made it mean everything. Because when cruelty is delivered casually, it lands heavier. It feels truer, like it didn't need decoration. He didn't scream, he didn't exaggerate, he just said it. And suddenly, the monarchy didn't look like a monarchy anymore. It looked like a reality show. Characters, plot twists, betrayals, public sympathy arcs, private contradictions, everything simplified into something disturbingly easy to understand. And that's where the danger is. Because once people stop seeing royalty as untouchable, once they start seeing it as entertainment, as spectacle, respect quietly dissolves. And then the conversation widened. It wasn't just comedians anymore. It wasn't just one stage, one night, one performance. Voices started stacking. Observations, comments, private opinions leaking into public space.
No one asked for this. Nobody. Nobody is curious to see the Meg doing any of these things. And the main reason for it is because she's established in the public eye as a self-centered, bossy, selfish narcissist.
And none of them sounded protective. None of them sounded careful. They sounded finished. Because when criticism starts coming from every direction, media, comedians, insiders, it stops being isolated. It becomes a pattern. And patterns are harder to ignore. Then came the word that kept echoing, quietly at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. Grifters, not shouted, not debated, just stated. casually, repeatedly, from places you wouldn't expect. And that's when it stopped being gossip. That's when it started feeling like a label people were willing to accept. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud: labels don't appear overnight. They build slowly, piece by piece, interview by interview, decision by decision, until one day someone says it out loud, and instead of shock, you get recognition. And that recognition, that's the real turning point. Because once the audience agrees, even silently, the story can't go back to what it was. The image doesn't repair itself, it doesn't reset, it just shifts permanently. And the most unsettling part, this didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something worse, because now the narrative isn't controlled anymore. Now it belongs to everyone watching, everyone commenting, everyone connecting dots in their own way. And when that happens, the story stops being told by the people inside it. And here's where the story takes a darker turn, because once the narrative escapes control, it doesn't just drift, it mutates. Every past moment gets re-examined, every interview replayed with a different lens, every statement turned inside out. And suddenly, what once looked like confidence starts looking like calculation. What once felt like vulnerability begins to resemble strategy. People don't just watch anymore, they investigate. They compare timelines. They notice contradictions. And the silence between events, that becomes the loudest clue of all. Because think about it, the promise was simple: independence, authenticity, a fresh start away from the machine. But what followed didn't feel like distance, it felt like amplification. Cameras didn't disappear, they multiplied. Stories didn't stop, they escalated. Privacy became content. And that contradiction quietly, persistently started eroding the foundation of everything. Then the industry itself began responding, not with outrage, not with public takedowns, but with something far more dangerous: indifference. Deals announced with fanfare started dissolving without explanation. Projects launched with global attention faded without impact. And behind the scenes, something colder was happening. Doors weren't slamming shut. They were simply not opening anymore. And that's when the commentary sharpened. Not just jokes, not just headlines, but observations that felt almost surgical. People who had seen everything in Hollywood, scandals that would destroy ordinary careers, were now saying something far more final. You can survive failure, but you cannot survive being perceived as empty. And once that idea takes hold, it spreads fast because it explains everything in one brutal sentence. The podcast that vanished after one season. The deals that sounded massive but delivered almost nothing. The appearances that generated headlines but no lasting loyalty. One by one, each piece started fitting into a narrative that didn't need exaggeration anymore. It didn't need drama, it just needed memory. And then came the most dangerous shift of all mockery, turning into consensus, because jokes are harmless until they're repeated, and repetition turns humor into belief. When multiple voices from completely different corners start landing on the same conclusion, it stops sounding like bias. It starts sounding like truth people are willing to accept. Even the idea of victimhood, once powerful, once emotionally untouchable, began to lose its grip, because repetition works both ways. Tell the same story too many times, and eventually people stop reacting. Not because they don't understand it, but because they feel like they've already heard it. And once empathy turns into fatigue, the entire dynamic flips. Suddenly, instead of sympathy, there's skepticism. Instead of support, there are questions. And once questions take over, the story doesn't move forward anymore, it starts collapsing inward. And then, almost quietly, history entered the conversation. Not directly, not dramatically, but through comparison. Patterns, familiar arcs, figures from the past who followed eerily similar paths, outsiders entering powerful institutions, reshaping narratives, challenging structures, and eventually becoming the center of the very chaos they once claimed to escape. And when those comparisons started landing, they didn't feel random. They felt inevitable, because patterns don't repeat by accident. They repeat because something deeper stays the same. And that's where the discomfort reaches its peak, because now the question isn't what happened. The question is what happens next. Because once the audience decides they've seen this story before, they also believe they know how it ends. And that belief, that expectation, it becomes almost impossible to break. Meanwhile, the image continues to fracture in small, almost invisible ways, not through one explosive scandal, but through 1,000 tiny doubts stacking on top of each other. A comment here, a statistic there, a clip resurfacing, a contradiction noticed. None of them devastating on their own, but together, they create something far more powerful than a single controversy. They create a narrative that feels self-sustaining. And that's the real shift. Because now the story doesn't need need new events to stay alive. It feeds on its own history. Every new moment is judged against everything that came before it. Every attempt to reset is measured against the pattern people think they've already figured out. So when comedians speak now, it doesn't feel like provocation anymore. It feels like confirmation, like they're just saying out loud what the audience has already decided. And that's why the laughter feels different. It's not surprise, it's recognition, which brings us back to that moment on stage, that stillness, that split second where the laughter faded just enough to reveal something underneath it. Because maybe that was the real story all along, not the jokes, not the headlines, not even the criticism, but the realization spreading quietly through the room that something irreversible had already happened. The image had shifted, the narrative had changed hands, and the people at the center of it, they were no longer controlling how the story was being told. And once that happens, it never really goes back, because in the end, reputations don't collapse in one dramatic fall. They erode, slowly, quietly, publicly, until one day someone says something on a stage and instead of shock, the room just understands. And that understanding, that silent agreement, that's the part you don't come back from.